Smith shocked the Oscar audience by slapping Chris Rock. Happened on stage after the comedian made a joke about Smith's wife, Jada Pinkett. During his acceptance speech, a teary-eyed Smith apologized to the Academy, but not to Rock himself. After the show, LAPD said Rock would not be pressing charges. What is going on?
The first thing that stood out for me was what Will Smith must have been going through, because after he struck this gentleman on the stage, when he came back, his voice was really shaky, and I could witness that. And I don't know, I felt really immense compassion of what he was going through at that point in time, which could have led him to do what he did, because there was a moment where probably he just wasn't himself. And it got me really curious about what could have led to that, Dave. And I think that's what I have been pondering about. Yeah.
Very good. Can I give you a couple of perspectives?
Absolutely. Delighted to hear.
So again, I actually have a lot of different scenarios, because I've really enjoyed some of the discourse and listening to some of people's opinions, all the way from someone I have huge respect for, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar.
Mm-hmm.
He's very much an advocate for people to get along with friends who look totally different than themselves. And example is Kareem and Bruce Lee. And so when I watched the clip a couple of times, and Chris was making a joke, and it was, as according to comics, it was a pretty mild joke. Joe Rogan's talked all about it, and he says a very mild joke. Yet, in the first reaction, Will was laughing, and then he looked at his wife, and his wife gave him a look, and I really had the feeling that they've talked a lot about this in therapy, because it was a look that he might not stand up for her. He doesn't feel for her. He doesn't have, and so it immediately put him to the reptilian reactive mode that he needed to do something. And so out of fear, out of humiliation, out of shame that he feels that his relationship is very fragile, he went up and did something out of character, which was, and again, you got to think, this is the guy who was Muhammad Ali in a movie. So he goes up and he slaps the other guy as opposed to belts him. So there's an element there from many, many different angles that he reacted, reptilian, defensive, had to do something to prove to his wife that he wasn't going to allow her to be mistreated, abused, not respected. And so that is my dynamic. And I found it to be quite fascinating to look at it from a therapeutic perspective. And that's what I came up with. And then there's, again, the whole angle of Chris and the way that he handled it. And then my business mind went, oh, what a great scenario, because this is now the most talked about event in the world of entertainment. And they would have to pay approximately $973 million to get this type of PR for both Will and for Chris and for the Oscars. And so there's a bit of jumping around with different perspectives on it.
Yes. And I saw that moment, and reflecting back on what you said, that look, going from that laughter to that very serious thing. And when I'm pondering about it, Dave, I'm just thinking that whatever may be happening in other people's lives, we need to make sense of how we're going to respond to it ourselves. So there may be an expectation, especially in marital relationships, that you need to stand up, you need to speak up, and so on. However, that individual needs to make sense of it on their own. It can't be because I'm expected to behave a certain way. And that is what I was taking away, saying that even in such an intimate relationship, everybody has to make sense of it, and they need to come out to say that, yes, I understand where you're coming from. I still need to process this and see how I want to respond to it. Because otherwise, this is not surprising that you go into a reactive mode because you haven't yet processed how you want to respond to such situations. Because we cannot have situations where nobody says anything. Triggers are going to be there everywhere, right? So being triggered is something we can't stop, but we have to make sense of how we want to respond to that trigger. The trigger we can't stop, but how we want to respond to the trigger. It has led me to also think about how it is not fair to expect even people who are closest in your relationship to behave a certain way that you want them to behave. whether it is your friend, it's your parent, it is your spouse, they are processing it their own way, because what makes us and what shapes us is so different. Although we are all similar in many ways, but what makes us and shapes us in terms of what we are going through is so different. So it was really beautiful. So I agree with what your perspective is, how that transformation happened. We all witnessed that. And not to mention, no publicity is bad publicity at the end of the day.
The strains of consciousness and the discussions are quite broad, because we all have our own story.
Correct.
And so this is triggering the story. It's like for a comic to actually have somebody from the audience come up and hit them, that is assault. That is something that it might next be a gun from the audience. And so there's a whole realm of violence that is discussed. And then those who have gone through domestic violence or violence, they're saying that this is absolutely wrong. He should be arrested and locked up. And then there's the whole area of whether the wealthy always get off. They can commit whatever crime they want. And so they're above the law. And
yeah, and you're right.
There's these streams of discussion that are coming from it, that if you have a trigger, or you have a cause, or you have a passion, and this is in the scope of it, you've got a very strong energetic charge around your opinion. And that's what's really coming out that I'm noticing online, is that we're getting totally polarized opinions, similar to what's happening in a lot of America right now. And I think trickling down to other parts of the world, because they're such a leader in dictating popular culture. Mm-hmm. And that's a challenge that I'm having, is even watching the Oscars, which I don't anymore, yet I do find it to be a facade, a fantasy land, yet many of the people who are most admired in that world aren't necessarily who they portray in the movies.
And because everybody is going through their own human experience, and these situations bring that to light so well. And I also was thinking this morning that for Chris on the stage, that experience, he may say it's okay, he's apologized and moved on, but that is going to stay in his psyche forever. And next time when he's going to interact, perhaps even impact how free and natural he would be, he will have to work on that himself as well, because it's a really unexpected impact. And sometimes it's very difficult to get it out of the head, saying, oh, this happened to me. So you're right, there's like variety of perspectives, but there is definitely a question about mental health. We're not talking about anxiety and depression just like that. We're talking about how things can simmer for a long time before you really don't know what you're doing. So my compassion and best wishes for both parties to get over this in a way that we can all learn from this experience and be better.
Very good. And I think that's one of the things that hopefully we can take away from it, is that by having a question answer to explore, and it's very much what you and I've been looking to do when we're running our diversity and inclusion conversations. It's about having a space where people are allowed to articulate and say what they're feeling, what they're experiencing. And quite often when they say it, they can change their mind, because it's a process that we're not being encouraged and nurtured and supported to actually simply say how you feel, and then maybe not even knowing what the feeling is. And so that's one of the things that I really enjoy, our opportunities to invite male leaders to discuss inclusion, to discuss topics that, how do you feel if your child's deciding they would rather have a gender change? Because some men would fly off the handle, others would be very curious and engaged, and this is what perhaps can be another lesson from the Oscar slap down. And so there can be a little bit of breaking pattern, yet having a energetically charged conversation about something.
Yeah, and that also brings to light about, in this Jada, we've not spoken about Jada. Now, what must have Jada gone through? She looked at Will looking for support, yes, and we all witnessed that. And that moment transformed Will we could see that as well. However, when I reflect back of how Jada must be looking at it right now, how must she be feeling? So this is also very relevant in terms of what we are talking about diversity and inclusion, right? We speak about mansplaining and bro-propagating. We don't want men to come there and start shielding and fighting, but still stand up and speak up. So it's that beautiful, mature way of looking at it is what we are inviting people to.
That's actually, when I watched it, some things this morning, that was the first, this is an example of male toxicity. Mm-hmm. And so that word was being used. And again, the conversation of male toxicity. When I saw Jada's look, again, it triggered the therapist in me to, wow, that look has happened quite a few times in their therapy classes, because yes. It was like, see, you're not doing anything again. See, you're not standing up for me. And so there was that call out, yet it wasn't in needy. It was more this laser right into the crux of some of his behaviors makes her feel in a certain way. And while his words and his actions quite often are not congruent with what he says. And so that's part of my interpretation, which again has a bias, it has a story, it has a history, and yes. That in many ways is the operating systems that come into living life. And each of us have them, and it's perhaps a nice question for people to ask themselves is, what was your response to the three dynamics? And this is very popular in something healing called constellation work, where you have family constellation, and people can go into the traumas with parents or grandparents and bring in part of the healing that allows them to have some of those conversations that were never had.
Absolutely. And at the world stage as well, we are witnessing where maybe there were clear reasons to do what people did, but the action wasn't. So this is where reason and action, in between there is some processing that needs to be done, because otherwise the action is more reaction. So how can we make sure that we reason with reason and respond? It's really something that fascinating, and it's something that all of us need to process, I would say. Yeah. So
thank you for your time, and thank you for your insights. And this was
an conscious conversation.
Yes, conscious conversation. Thank you so much.
Taken by the standing ovation. I felt like Hollywood is just spineless, en masse, and it really felt like, oh, this is a really clear indication that we're not the cool club anymore. This morning that I was suing Will for $200 million, because that video is going to be there forever.